The flour dust caught the lamplight like snow in a winter storm, and Beatrice Sterling knew she had exactly 3 hours before dawn would break over Durango, Colorado, and with it, her only chance to keep the bakery another week. The year was 1883, and the silver mining boom had turned this mountain town into a place where fortunes changed hands faster than cards in a poker game. But Beatrice's fortune had been running dry ever since her father died 6 months ago, leaving her with nothing but debts, a failing bakery, and the recipes he had taught her when she was still young enough to believe that hard work and good bread could solve any problem. She wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist, careful not to touch her face with flour-covered hands, and checked the temperature of the massive cast iron oven that dominated the back wall of the small kitchen. The heat rolled out in waves, turning the November chill into something almost tropical, and she welcomed it because it meant the oven was ready, and ready meant she could start baking the 30 loaves of sourdough, 20 loaves of wheat, and 15 loaves of rye that she hoped would sell before the Saturday market closed, and Mr. Patterson came to collect the rent she owed. The sourdough starter bubbled in its crock like something alive, which in a way it was, passed down from her grandmother who had brought it across the plains in a covered wagon 30 years earlier. Beatrice had fed it every day of her life since her father first showed her how, and the thought of losing it because she could not pay the rent made her throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the flour in the air. She shaped the first loaves with practiced hands, her fingers knowing the work so well that her mind could wander to dangerous places, like wondering what she would do if the bread did not sell, or where she would go if Patterson evicted her, or whether she should have accepted Martin Crawley's proposal last spring even though the banker's son made her skin crawl and his eyes were too close together. At least she would have had security, her aunt had said, but Beatrice had chosen the bakery instead, chosen the smell of yeast and the satisfaction of creating something with her own hands. And now she was facing the consequences of choosing passion over practicality. The dough went into the oven in batches, and while the first loaves baked, she started on the wheat bread, mixing flour and water and salt with the kind of rhythm that came from repetition, from doing the same thing in the same way so many times that it became less like work and more like breathing. Through the small window above the work table, she could see the darkness starting to soften at the edges, which meant dawn was coming whether she was ready or not. The first batch came out perfect, golden brown and smelling like everything good in the world, and she set the loaves on the cooling racks with a small prayer that today would be different, that today the miners would have money and the merchants would need bread, and she would sell every single loaf and have enough left over to pay Patterson and buy more flour and maybe, just maybe, make it through another week. She was sliding the last batch into the oven when she heard the horse outside. Beatrice froze, listening. Durango was not a quiet town even at dawn, with miners heading to the hills and freight wagons rumbling down Main Street. But this was different. A single horse moving slowly, purposefully, stopping right outside her bakery. Through the window, she could see nothing but darkness and the faint glow of the street lamp on the corner, but she heard the creak of leather as someone dismounted, heard boots on the wooden boardwalk, heard the door to the front of the shop open with the small bell she had hung above it tinkling once, twice. She wiped her hands on her apron and pushed through the curtain that separated the kitchen from the shop, ready to tell whoever it was that the bread was not ready yet, and they would have to wait for the market to open. The man standing in her shop was tall enough that he had to duck slightly under the doorframe, and in the lamplight, she could see that he was covered in trail dust, his boots worn and his coat the kind of heavy canvas that cowboys wore when they expected to be outside in all weather. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face, but she could see the strong line of his jaw and the way he held himself, loose and easy like he was comfortable in his own skin, in a way that Beatrice had never quite managed to be. "We are not open yet," she said, and her voice came out sharper than she intended, defensive in the way of people who are tired and scared and trying not to show it. He took off his hat, and she saw his face properly for the first time. He was younger than she expected, maybe 25 or 26, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-green, like sage growing on the hillside. His face was weathered in the way of men who spent their lives outside, but there was something kind in his expression, something that made her instinctive defensiveness soften just slightly. "I can smell the bread," he said, and his voice was deep and a little rough, like he had not used it much recently. "I have been riding for 2 days straight, and that smell is about the best thing I have encountered in a very long time. I know you are not open, but I was hoping I might buy a loaf or two before I head out to the ranch." Beatrice hesitated. She needed every loaf for the market, needed to display them all in neat rows and hope that the presentation would entice buyers, but she also needed money. And a sale now was worth the same as a sale later, and there was something in the way he looked at her, direct but not presumptuous, that made her want to help him. "The last batch is still in the oven," she said, "but the ones on the cooling racks are ready. How many did you want?" He stepped further into the shop, and she caught the smell of horse and leather and the outdoors, not unpleasant but very different from the yeast and flour she was used to. He looked at the racks visible through the kitchen doorway, at the rows of golden loaves still steaming slightly in the cool morning air. "How much for all of it?" he asked. Beatrice stared at him. "All of what?" "All the bread. Everything you have baked tonight." He said it casually, like he was asking about the weather, like buying an entire night's worth of bread was a perfectly normal thing to do. "That is 65 loaves," she said slowly, trying to figure out if he was joking or drunk or just confused. "Plus the 15 still in the oven." "Why would you need 80 loaves of bread?" He smiled, and it changed his whole face, made him look younger and less worn down by whatever he had been doing for the past 2 days. "I work for the Quincy Vale Ranch, about 10 miles north of here. We just hired on 30 new hands for the winter. And the cook quit yesterday after a disagreement with the foreman about whether beans needed to be soaked before cooking. We are running short on supplies, and I figured fresh bread would go a long way toward keeping the men from mutinying before we can hire a new cook." 30 new hands, Beatrice repeated, her mind already calculating what 80 loaves would cost, what it would mean to sell everything at once instead of hoping the market would be kind. "That is a lot of cowboys." "The owner is expanding, buying up the neighboring properties and consolidating the herds. It is going to be one of the biggest operations in Colorado by spring." He pulled out a leather wallet from his inside pocket, well worn but clearly containing money. "I can pay whatever you think is fair." "Honestly, you would be saving my life. The foreman put me in charge of supplies after the cook left, and if I come back empty-handed, he is going to assign me to latrine duty for the rest of the season." Beatrice did the math in her head. At market prices, 80 loaves would bring in enough to pay Patterson, buy more supplies, and have a little left over for the first time in months. It seemed too good to be true, which usually meant it was, but the money in his wallet looked real enough, and the story about the ranch made sense. She had heard about the Quincy Vale expansion. Everyone in Durango had, because it meant jobs and business and the kind of economic activity that kept a town alive. $2.50 a dozen, she said, which was her market price, fair but not cheap. He did not even blink. "That is about $17 for 80 loaves. How about I give you 25, and you throw in whatever baking tips you think might help a bunch of cowboys not poison themselves trying to make biscuits. $25. Beatrice felt her heart start to race. $25 was more than she made in a good week, more than enough to pay Patterson and restock and actually sleep without anxiety crushing her chest. It was too much. She should tell him so, should be honest that he was overpaying. But the words stuck in her throat because honesty was a luxury she could not quite afford at 4 in the morning with debt collectors circling. You do not have to pay extra, she made herself say, because her father had raised her to be honest even when it hurt. The market price is fair. I am sure it is, he said, and his smile was back, warm and genuine. But I am buying your entire stock, which means you cannot sell to anyone else today, which means you are losing potential customers. Consider it a convenience fee. He was giving her an out, a way to take the extra money without feeling like charity, and Beatrice was grateful enough to accept it. All right, she said. $25, and I will write down some basic recipes that are hard to mess up. Give me a few minutes to get the last batch out of the oven and cooled enough to wrap. I will start loading the ones that are ready, he said, counting out bills from his wallet and setting them on the counter between them. If you have crates or boxes, I can pack them so they travel well. They worked in a strange kind of harmony, Beatrice pulling the final loaves from the oven and wrapping them in clean cloths while the cowboy, whose name she still did not know, carried them out to his horse and arranged them in the saddlebags and bedroll with surprising care. He moved efficiently, economically, like someone who was used to working hard and not wasting motion, and she found herself sneaking glances at him when she thought he was not looking. I am Quincy Vale, he said as he came back for another load, catching her mid-glance and making her cheeks heat with embarrassment. I should have introduced myself earlier. My mother would be ashamed of my manners. Beatrice Sterling, she replied, focusing very hard on wrapping a loaf of rye. This is my father's bakery. Was my father's bakery. It is mine now. I am sorry for your loss, Quincy said, and he sounded like he meant it, not just saying the words because they were expected. Running a business alone cannot be easy. It is not, Beatrice admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. There was something about the early morning hour and the fact that she would probably never see this man again that made her willing to be truthful. But it is what I have, and I am not ready to give it up yet. That is a good philosophy, Quincy said. Stubbornness can carry you through a lot of hard times. I would know. I have been stubborn about enough things in my life. By the time all 80 loaves were wrapped and loaded, the sun was starting to paint the eastern sky pink and gold, and Beatrice's back ached from the night of baking, and her eyes burned from lack of sleep. But she felt lighter than she had in months. The $25 sat in her apron pocket, solid and real, and for the first time since her father died, she could imagine a future that did not involve losing everything. The recipes, Quincy reminded her gently as she walked him to the door, and she realized she had been so focused on the money and the bread that she had forgotten her promise. Right, of course. She grabbed a piece of paper and a pencil from behind the counter and started writing quickly, her handwriting messier than usual but still legible. Basic biscuits, cornbread, and a simple stew that is hard to ruin. If your cowboys can boil water, they can make these. Quincy took the paper and folded it carefully, tucking it into his shirt pocket. Thank you, Beatrice Sterling. You might have just saved my life, or at least my dignity. Thank you for buying all my bread, she countered, and then before she could stop herself, added, if your ranch needs a regular supplier, I could arrange deliveries. I mean, if the quality is good enough and the price is right. I am just saying that I bake every day anyway, and if you need bread, I could provide it." She was babbling. She knew she was babbling. But the thought of regular income from a big ranch like Quincy Valley was too tempting to ignore, even if it meant making a fool of herself in front of a handsome cowboy. Quincy studied her for a long moment, and she could not read his expression. Then he smiled again, that same warm smile that made her stomach do strange things. "I think that could be arranged. Let me talk to the foreman and the owner, see what kind of regular order we might need. Can I come back in a few days with an answer?" "Yes," Beatrice said, trying not to sound too eager and failing completely. "Yes, that would be good. I am here every morning baking for the market. Then I will see you in a few days, Beatrice Sterling." He put his hat back on, tipping it to her in a gesture that was probably old-fashioned even in 1883, but somehow seemed natural coming from him. "Take care of yourself. You too, Quincy Vale." She watched him mount his horse, watched him adjust the load of bread with careful hands, watched him ride off down Main Street as the sun continued its slow rise over the mountains. Even after he disappeared from view, she stood in the doorway for a long moment, breathing in the cool morning air and feeling something that might have been hope. The day passed in a strange blur. Beatrice paid Mr. Patterson his rent, enduring his surprise and thinly veiled disappointment that she had managed to come up with the money. She restocked her supplies, buying extra flour and yeast and salt, because for once she could afford to plan ahead. She cleaned the bakery from top to bottom, scrubbing the floors and the counters and the oven until everything gleamed, working out the nervous energy that thrummed through her body every time she thought about Quincy Vale and his promise to return. She told herself not to get her hopes up. He had been polite and he had paid well, but that did not mean anything would come of his vague mention of regular orders. Men said things they did not mean all the time, especially to women they wanted to impress or placate. She would be foolish to count on anything beyond the single transaction they had already completed. But despite her attempts at rational thinking, she found herself baking extra carefully over the next few days, found herself making sure the shop was tidy and her hair was neat under her kerchief, found herself listening for the sound of a horse outside whenever a customer came to the door. 3 days passed, then 4, then 5, and Beatrice felt her brief flicker of hope start to dim. Of course he was not coming back. Of course it had been too good to be true. She had been stupid to think otherwise, stupid to let herself imagine that one lucky morning could change the trajectory of her entire life. On the 6th day, she woke before dawn as always and started mixing dough with hands that felt mechanical, going through the motions because she did not know what else to do. The routine was comforting in its way, the same steps in the same order, the familiar smell of yeast and flour, the warmth of the oven against the November chill that was deepening as winter approached. She was shaping loaves when she heard the horse. Her hands stilled, flour dusting the air around her frozen fingers. It could be anyone, she told herself. Durango had hundreds of horses, thousands probably, and there was no reason to think this particular horse had anything to do with her. But then she heard the boots on the boardwalk, heard the bell above the door, and she knew. Quincy Vale stood in her shop again, looking less trail-worn this time but just as tall, just as solid. His eyes found her through the kitchen doorway, and he smiled like he was genuinely happy to see her. "Good morning, Beatrice. Good morning." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "You came back." "I said I would." He sounded faintly puzzled, like the idea of not keeping his word had never occurred to him. "I talked to the foreman and the owner. They want to place a regular order. 3 dozen loaves a week, delivered to the ranch every Saturday. We will pay $4 a week, in advance if you prefer." $4 a week, $16 a month, nearly $200 a year, steady and reliable. Beatrice had to grip the edge of the work table to keep from swaying. "That is more than generous," she managed to say. "It is fair," Quincy corrected. "You make good bread and we need it. Simple business. Can you handle that quantity every week without overextending yourself?" Yes, she did not hesitate. She would make it work, even if it meant less sleep and more hours in the kitchen. This was the kind of opportunity her father would have told her to grab with both hands. "Yes, I can do that." "Good." Quincy pulled out his wallet again, counting out bills. "Here is the first 2 weeks in advance. The owner insists on it, says it is only fair since we are asking you to plan around our needs. Can you have the first delivery ready this Saturday? I can come pick it up, save you the trip to the ranch." "I can have it ready," Beatrice confirmed, taking the money with hands that trembled slightly. "Saturday morning, 3 dozen loaves. Any particular kinds, or should I mix it up?" "Whatever you think is best. The men have been eating your bread all week, and I have not heard a single complaint. In fact, I have heard considerable praise, which is rare when you are dealing with 30 opinionated cowboys." Beatrice felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the oven. "I am glad they enjoyed it." "They did. We all did." Quincy hesitated, then added, "I was wondering if you might have time for a cup of coffee. I know you have been working all night, and I do not want to intrude, but I wanted to thank you properly for helping me out last week. You saved me from latrine duty, and that deserves more than just a business transaction." She should say no. She had work to do, bread to bake, a schedule to maintain. But she was looking at Quincy Vale's hopeful expression, at the way he held his hat in his hands like a nervous schoolboy, and she found herself nodding. "I could use a break," she said. "There is a pot on the stove in the back. It is not fancy, but it is strong." They sat at the small table in the corner of the kitchen, the same table where Beatrice ate her meals and did her accounts, and sometimes fell asleep with her head on her arms when the exhaustion became too much. Quincy looked too large for the delicate chair, but he sat carefully, cradling the tin cup of coffee like it was fine china. "How long have you been at Quinn Valley Ranch?" Beatrice asked, because the silence felt awkward and she wanted to know more about this man who had appeared in her life like something out of a story. "About 2 years," Quincy said. "I came to Colorado from Wyoming after my father died. He had a small ranch up north, but when he passed, my older brother inherited it and there was not enough work for both of us. So I drifted south, picked up work where I could find it, and eventually landed at Quinn Valley. The owner, Mr. Harrison, he is a good man. Fair wages, decent conditions. I have worked worse places." "I am sorry about your father," Beatrice said softly. "It is hard losing a parent." "It is," Quincy agreed. "You understand that better than most. When did your father pass? 6 months ago. Heart gave out while he was kneading dough. The doctor said it was quick, that he probably did not feel much pain, but I do not know if that is true or just something he said to make me feel better." She stared into her coffee, watching the steam rise in delicate spirals. "I found him in the morning when I came down to start the baking. He was just lying there on the floor, with flour all around him like snow." Quincy reached across the table and covered her hand with his, a brief, warm pressure that lasted only a moment but felt significant nonetheless. "That must have been terrible." "It was the worst day of my life," Beatrice said. And then, because the words were already flowing, because something about Quincy made her want to be honest, she added, "He left debts. A lot of debts. Bad investments and some gambling I did not know about. I have been trying to keep the bakery afloat, trying to pay everything off, but it has been hard. Until you showed up last week, I was not sure I was going to make it." "And now?" Quincy asked gently. "Now I have a chance," Beatrice said. A real chance. The regular order from your ranch, that changes everything. That gives me stability, something I can plan around. I cannot tell you what that means to me. I am glad we could help, Quincy said. And I am glad I stopped in last week, even though it was barely dawn and you looked like you wanted to throw me out. Beatrice felt her cheeks heat. I did not want to throw you out. You looked very stern, Quincy said, but he was smiling. Very much like someone who did not want to be bothered by dusty cowboys before sunrise. I was tired and stressed and convinced I was going to lose everything, Beatrice admitted. I am sorry if I was rude. You were not rude. You were careful, which is smart for a woman alone in a shop at dawn. I respected it. They talked for another hour, the conversation flowing easier than Beatrice would have expected. Quincy told her about the ranch, about the cattle and the horses and the other hands he worked with. He told her about growing up in Wyoming, about learning to ride before he could walk, about the harsh winters and the beautiful summers and the constant work that came with ranching. In turn, Beatrice told him about learning to bake from her father, about the sourdough starter that was older than she was, about her dreams of maybe expanding the bakery someday, adding pastries and cakes if she could ever save enough money. You should, Quincy said firmly. You are talented. Anyone who can make bread that good should be making everything else too. Talent does not pay the bills, Beatrice said, but she was smiling. No, but it is a start. Talent and hard work, that is a combination that can take you anywhere. Eventually, Quincy glanced out the window and saw that the sun was fully up, that Main Street was filling with morning traffic, and he stood reluctantly. I should get back to the ranch. I have duties waiting, and the foreman will have my head if I am gone too long. Thank you for the coffee, Beatrice said, standing as well and immediately feeling how sore her back was from the night of baking. Thank you for the company, Quincy replied. I will see you Saturday morning for the first delivery. Saturday morning, Beatrice confirmed. At the door, Quincy paused and turned back. Would it be all right if I came a bit early on Saturday? Maybe had another cup of coffee before I load the bread? Beatrice's heart did something complicated in her chest. Yes, she said. Yes, that would be all right. Saturday could not come fast enough. Beatrice threw herself into her work with renewed energy, baking bread for the daily market and planning the ranch order with meticulous care. She experimented with different combinations, trying to create variety while ensuring quality, and she found herself thinking about Quincy's reaction to each loaf, wondering what he would like best. It was foolish, she knew. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. The fact that Quincy was kind and handsome and easy to talk to did not mean anything beyond basic human decency. She was reading too much into simple politeness, letting her imagination run away with her like a character in one of the dime novels she sometimes read when she could not sleep. But knowing something was foolish did not stop her from washing her hair on Friday night, did not stop her from pressing her best dress, did not stop her from being extra careful with the Saturday morning baking, making sure each loaf was perfect. Quincy arrived just after dawn, right on time, and the smile he gave her when he walked through the door made all her nervous preparation feel worthwhile. Good morning, Beatrice. Something smells amazing. Good morning, Quincy. I just pulled the last batch out. Let me get you that coffee. They fell into an easy routine. While the bread cooled, they sat at the kitchen table and talked, covering everything from the weather to politics to their favorite foods. Quincy was smart and thoughtful, with opinions on things Beatrice would not have expected a cowboy to care about, and he listened when she spoke like he was genuinely interested in what she had to say. How is the ranch managing without a cook? Beatrice asked at one point. We hired someone new, Quincy said. Fellow named Jim who worked on a cattle drive up from Texas. He is competent, knows his way around a chuck wagon, but his bread is terrible, hard as rocks. The men still talk about your loaves like they were manna from heaven. I am glad I can provide something the men enjoy, Beatrice said. Do you think Mr. Harrison would be open to increasing the order at some point? I do not want to overstep, but if the demand is there, I could potentially supply more. I will ask, Quincy promised. Harrison is always looking for ways to keep the men happy. Good food goes a long way toward preventing trouble, and we have had enough trouble already with the expansion. Rustlers have been hitting the outer ranges, taking cattle, causing problems. Anything that keeps morale up is worth the investment. Rustlers, Beatrice felt a flutter of concern. Is it dangerous? It can be, Quincy admitted. But we have good men and Harrison hired extra security. I would not worry too much. It is just the way of things out here sometimes. When the bread was loaded and paid for, Quincy lingered in the doorway like he was reluctant to leave. Same time next week, he asked. Same time next week, Beatrice confirmed. I will look forward to it. The weeks fell into a pattern. Every Saturday, Quincy arrived at dawn to collect the ranch order and share coffee and conversation with Beatrice before heading back to Quincy Vale. Every Saturday, Beatrice found herself looking forward to his arrival more than she wanted to admit, found herself thinking about him during the week when she was alone with her dough and her oven and her thoughts. They talked about everything and nothing. Quincy told her about life on the ranch, about the cattle drives and the roundups, and the endless work of maintaining such a large operation. Beatrice told him about her childhood in Durango, about her mother who had died when she was young, about her father's dreams for the bakery that had never quite materialized. They discovered they both loved reading. Both had a fondness for terrible puns. Both preferred coffee black and strong enough to strip paint. It was the easiest friendship Beatrice had ever had, and she tried not to think too hard about the fact that it felt like more than friendship, that her heart raced when she heard his horse outside, that she dreamed about him more nights than not. Winter settled over Durango with serious intent, bringing snow that piled high in the streets and temperatures that made the oven's heat feel like a blessing instead of a curse. Beatrice baked through it all, her routine unchanged except for the weekly highlight of Quincy's visits, which had become the thing she oriented her entire week around. In late December, nearly 2 months after their first meeting, Quincy arrived on a Saturday morning covered in snow and looking worried. "What is wrong?" Beatrice asked immediately, pouring coffee with hands that wanted to shake. "Harrison wants to talk to you," Quincy said. "About expanding the order and possibly doing some special baking for a celebration he is planning. He asked if you would be willing to come out to the ranch, meet with him directly. I told him I would ask, but I also told him I was not sure you would want to make the trip in this weather." Beatrice considered. Going to the ranch meant closing the shop for a day, meant missing the Saturday market, but it also meant the possibility of more business, of securing her financial future even more firmly. And if she was being honest with herself, it meant a chance to see where Quincy lived and worked, to understand that part of his life better. "I will come," she said. "When does he want to meet? Today, if possible." "I brought the wagon instead of just my horse. Figured if you said yes, I could drive you out. The roads are rough but passable, and I promise to get you there and back safely." "Today," Beatrice repeated, her mind racing through everything she would need to do. "I can close the shop for one day. Let me change into warmer clothes and leave a note on the door. Give me 15 minutes. Quincy's smile was brilliant, warming her more than the oven ever could. "Thank you, Beatrice. This means a lot to Harrison and to me." The ride to Quincy Vale Ranch took nearly 2 hours. with the wagon creaking through snow that had drifted across the road in places. Quincy drove with steady competence, and Beatrice sat beside him bundled in her warmest cloak, watching the landscape transform from the familiar streets of Durango to the wild open country that stretched toward the mountains. "It is beautiful," she said at one point, looking at the way the sun caught the snow-covered peaks. "It is," Quincy agreed. "Sometimes I forget to notice it, getting caught up in the work, but then I will be out riding and the light will hit just right, and I remember why I love it out here." The ranch, when they reached it, was bigger than Beatrice had imagined, a sprawling complex of buildings arranged around a central yard. The main house was a large timber structure with smoke rising from multiple chimneys, and the barns and outbuildings were well maintained and sturdy. Cowboys moved between buildings despite the cold, going about their work with the kind of purposeful efficiency that spoke to good management. Quincy helped her down from the wagon, his hands steady on her waist, and for a moment they stood very close, their breath making clouds in the cold air. Then he stepped back, professional and polite, and led her toward the main house. Mr. Harrison turned out to be a man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a firm handshake. He welcomed Beatrice into his office, a comfortable room lined with books and maps, and got straight to business. "Miss Sterling, Quincy has been bringing me reports of the quality of your baking, and I have tasted the results myself. You are very talented, and I would like to expand our arrangement. In addition to the regular weekly order, I am hosting a celebration in January for my daughter's engagement. I need desserts, pastries, cakes, enough to feed about 100 people. Can you handle something of that scale?" Beatrice's mind raced, calculating quantities and timing and cost. It would be a massive undertaking, requiring her to bake for days in advance, but it would also bring in enough money to pay off the last of her father's debts and actually start saving for the future. "I can handle it," she said firmly. "I will need specifics about quantities and flavors, and I will need payment for supplies in advance. But yes, I can do it." They spent the next hour working out details, with Quincy occasionally adding input about logistics and transportation. By the time they were done, Beatrice had secured the largest single order of her life, along with an increased weekly bread order and a promise of recommendations to Harrison's wealthy neighbors. As Harrison walked them out, he paused and looked at Quincy with an expression that was hard to read. "Vale, why do not you show Miss Sterling around the ranch before you drive her back? Give her a sense of the operation. Let her meet some of the men who enjoy her bread so much." "Yes, sir," Quincy said, and if he was surprised by the suggestion, he hit it well. The tour took them through the barns where the horses wickered in their stalls, past the bunkhouse where several cowboys called out greetings to Quincy and tipped their hats to Beatrice, and finally, to a small rise that overlooked the entire ranch with the mountains rising behind it like sentinels. "This is my favorite spot," Quincy said quietly. "I come here when I need to think, when the bunkhouse gets too loud or the work gets too frustrating. It helps to see the whole picture, remember that I am part of something bigger." "Thank you for showing me," Beatrice said. "And thank you for convincing Harrison to give me a chance. I know you must have put in a good word." "I told him the truth," Quincy said, "that you are the best baker I have ever encountered and that you deserve the business. The rest was all you." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out at the ranch and the mountains beyond. Then Quincy said very carefully, "Beatrice, I need to tell you something and I am not sure how you are going to take it." Her heart started to pound. "What is it?" "I did not just recommend you to Harrison because you make good bread," Quincy said, still looking out at the view instead of at her. "I mean, you do make excellent bread. That is absolutely true, but my motivations were not entirely professional. I recommended you because I wanted an excuse to keep seeing you every week. Because over the past 2 months, you have become the best part of my week, the thing I look forward to most. And I realize this might be completely inappropriate, that you might not feel the same way at all, but I had to tell you because I cannot keep pretending this is just business when it feels like so much more. Beatrice could barely breathe. Quincy. He finally turned to look at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes made her chest ache. If I have overstepped, if this is unwelcome, please tell me now and I will never mention it again. We can go back to being just business associates and I will respect that. But I had to at least tell you the truth. You have not overstepped, Beatrice said, the words tumbling out in a rush. I look forward to Saturday mornings too. I think about you during the week. I bake better knowing you are going to taste the results. I have been telling myself it was foolish, that I was reading too much into kindness and regular business. But if you are saying it is not just in my head, then no, you have not overstepped at all. The smile that spread across Quincy's face was like sunrise. Really? Really? Beatrice confirmed. And then suddenly he was moving toward her, and she was moving toward him, and they met in the middle, his arms wrapping around her in a hug that felt like coming home. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other on the snowy hillside while the wind whispered around them and the ranch spread out below. When they finally pulled apart, Quincy kept his hands on her shoulders, looking at her like she was something precious. "Can I court you properly?" he asked. "Take you to dinner, maybe go for walks when the weather improves. Do this right?" "Yes," Beatrice said, laughing because she felt light and happy and utterly giddy. "Yes, I would like that very much." The ride back to Durango felt different, charged with new possibility. They sat closer together on the wagon bench, and when Quincy helped her down outside her bakery, his hands lingered on her waist just a moment longer than necessary. "I will see you next Saturday," he said. "I will be counting the days," Beatrice replied and meant it. True to his word, Quincy began courting her with old-fashioned determination. He came to town on his days off, taking her to the small restaurant on Main Street or for walks through the snowy streets when she needed a break from baking. He brought her small gifts, nothing extravagant but thoughtful. A book he thought she would like, a ribbon the color of her eyes, a carved wooden spoon that fit her hand perfectly. Beatrice fell deeper in love with him every day, charmed by his kindness and his humor, and the way he treated her like an equal partner in conversation. He asked her opinions on things, listened when she talked about her dreams for the bakery, supported her ambitions instead of trying to diminish them. The engagement celebration order kept her busy through January, baking elaborate cakes and delicate pastries that pushed her skills to their limit. Quincy helped when he could, appearing at the bakery late at night to keep her company while she worked, washing dishes and wrapping finished products, and making her laugh when the stress threatened to overwhelm her. The celebration itself was a triumph. Beatrice's desserts were the talk of the party, and she found herself fielding requests from several of Harrison's guests for future orders. The money she earned paid off the last of her father's debts and left her with savings for the first time in her adult life. "You did it," Quincy told her that night after the party was over and he had driven her home through the darkness. "You saved the bakery, built something sustainable. Your father would be so proud." "I could not have done it without you," Beatrice said. "You gave me the opportunity, the confidence. You believed in me." "I will always believe in you," Quincy said seriously. "Always." Winter gave way to spring and their courtship deepened. Quincy began staying later during his visits, helping with the baking or just sitting in the corner of the kitchen reading while Beatrice worked. They fell into comfortable domesticity, the kind of easy partnership that made Beatrice think about the future in a way she never had before. In May, with wildflowers blooming on the hillsides and the snow finally melted from all but the highest peaks, Quincy asked her to go on a picnic. They rode out to his favorite spot on the ranch, the rise overlooking the valley, and spread a blanket in the sunshine while the breeze carried the scent of pine and grass. "I love you," Quincy said as they sat watching clouds drift across the sky. "I have loved you since that first morning when you looked at me like I was crazy for wanting to buy all your bread. I love your strength and your talent and your stubbornness. I love the way you hum while you work and the way you get flour in your hair no matter how careful you are. I love everything about you, Beatrice Sterling, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." He pulled a small box from his pocket, opening it to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the sunlight. "Will you marry me?" he asked. "Will you let me wake up every morning to the smell of your baking and fall asleep every night knowing you are beside me? Will you build a life with me, here in Colorado, raising a family and growing old together?" Beatrice felt tears streaming down her face, but they were happy tears, joyful tears. "Yes," she said. "Yes, absolutely yes." The ring fit perfectly, sliding onto her finger like it had been made for her. Quincy kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Beatrice kissed him back with all the love she had been holding inside for months. They were married in June in the small church in Durango, with half the town in attendance and the entire crew from Quincy Vale Ranch filling the back pews. Beatrice wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit, and carried wildflowers that Quincy had picked that morning. She had never felt more beautiful or more certain about anything in her life. Harrison gave them a small house on the ranch as a wedding present, close enough to the main buildings that Quincy could easily get to work, but far enough away to provide privacy. Beatrice arranged to keep the bakery in town running with the help of a young woman named Margaret, who had been apprenticing with her for a few months, allowing her to fulfill her town orders while focusing on the ranch business and her new marriage. The first months of marriage were an adjustment, learning to share space and decisions and intimacy, but Beatrice had never been happier. Quincy was an attentive husband, thoughtful and affectionate, and they settled into routines that worked for both of them. She baked in the early mornings while he did his ranch work, and they came together in the evenings to share meals and conversation, and the kind of quiet companionship that deepened into something profound. In the fall, Beatrice realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with equal parts joy and terror, but Quincy's delighted reaction soothed her fears. He immediately became protective without being overbearing, helping with the heavy work around the house, and insisting she rest more even though she felt perfectly fine. "I am not fragile," she protested one evening when he tried to take over all the kneading. "I know you are not," Quincy said, "but you are carrying our child and I want to help. Please let me help." She let him help, touched by his concern and his eagerness to be involved in every aspect of the pregnancy. Their son was born the following spring, arriving in the early hours of a warm April morning after a labor that was long but mercifully uncomplicated. They named him Samuel, after Beatrice's father, and from the moment Quincy held his son for the first time, Beatrice knew she had chosen the right man to build a life with. Watching Quincy with Samuel over the following months and years only reinforced that certainty. He was a devoted father, patient and playful, teaching their son to ride and rope while Beatrice taught him to bake and raid. They had 2 more children over the next 5 years, a daughter named Rose and another son named Daniel, and their little house on the ranch rang with laughter and love, and the controlled chaos of a growing family. The bakery continued to thrive, both the town location and the ranch operation, and Beatrice found herself training several apprentices and seriously considering opening a second location. Quincy supported her ambitions completely, proud of everything she had built and accomplished. As the years passed, Beatrice sometimes thought back to that desperate night when she had been baking bread to sell at dawn, certain she was going to lose everything, never imagining that the dusty cowboy who bought her whole batch would become her husband, her partner, the father of her children, and the love of her life. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Quincy one evening as they sat on the porch of their house, watching their children play in the yard while the sun set behind the mountains. "Regret what?" he asked, reaching over to take her hand. "Coming into the bakery that morning, buying all my bread. Getting tangled up with a desperate baker who had more debts than sense." Quincy laughed, the sound warm and familiar and beloved. "Not for a single second. That was the best decision I ever made, and I would make it again in a heartbeat. You and the children, this life we built together, it is everything I never knew I wanted." "I love you," Beatrice said, leaning against his shoulder. "I love you too," Quincy replied, kissing the top of her head. "Always and forever." They sat in comfortable silence as the light faded and the stars began to appear, content in the knowledge that they had built something real and lasting, a love born from flour and yeast, and a chance encounter at dawn that had changed both their lives forever. The children grew, as children do, and the quiet house that had once seemed so spacious began to feel crowded with young energy. Samuel inherited his father's love of horses and his mother's determination, and by the time he was 10, he could outride many of the ranch hands. Rose had Beatrice's eye for detail and Quincy's gentle nature, spending hours in the kitchen learning to bake, while also demanding that her father teach her everything he knew about ranching. Daniel was the wild card, full of mischief and charm, keeping both his parents on their toes with his endless energy and creative interpretations of the rules. The bakery became an empire of sorts, with 3 locations across Colorado and a thriving mail-order business that shipped Beatrice's famous sourdough starter to bakers across the country. She wrote a cookbook that became surprisingly popular, filled not just with recipes but with stories about her father and her journey from desperate baker to successful businesswoman. Quincy appeared in many of those stories, and he teased her gently about making him famous. "I am just a cowboy," he would say, but he was grinning when he said it, proud of her accomplishments and happy to be part of her story. Harrison retired eventually, and in a move that surprised everyone except Beatrice, he promoted Quincy to ranch foreman. The added responsibility suited Quincy well, and under his management, Quinn Valley Ranch continued to prosper and grow, becoming one of the most respected operations in Colorado. Years turned to decades. Samuel married a teacher from Denver and took over management of the bakery's business operations, freeing Beatrice to focus on recipe development and training. Rose shocked everyone by becoming a lawyer, one of the first women to practice in Colorado, fierce and brilliant and uncompromising in her pursuit of justice. Daniel joined the ranch operations, working alongside his father and eventually taking on more and more responsibility as Quincy began to slow down. Beatrice's hair turned gray, and Quincy developed a limp from an old riding injury. But they still took walks together every evening when the weather allowed, still sat on the porch and watched the sunset, still found reasons to laugh together over breakfast and hold hands across the table during dinner. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. The house overflowed with family, with love, with the kind of chaotic joy that comes from being surrounded by people you have known and cherished for years. Beatrice baked bread for the occasion, of course, using the sourdough starter that was now more than 60 years old, passing down the tradition to yet another generation. As the party wound down and the grandchildren were put to bed in various corners of the house, Beatrice and Quincy escaped to their favorite spot on the rise overlooking the valley. The view had not changed much in 3 decades, though the ranch had expanded, and new buildings dotted the landscape. But the mountains were still there, eternal and unchanging, and the stars still shone with the same brilliant clarity they had that first time Quincy brought her here. 30 years, Beatrice said, marveling at how quickly the time had passed, and yet how much they had packed into those years. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday that you walked into my bakery and bought all my bread. Best purchase I ever made, Quincy said, putting his arm around her shoulders and pulling her close. Though I will admit, I did not expect you to come with it. You got more than you bargained for, Beatrice agreed, smiling. I got exactly what I needed, Quincy corrected. I just did not know I needed it until I met you. They stayed on the rise until the cold drove them back to the house, back to the warmth and the family, and the life they had built together through hard work and love, and a willingness to take chances on each other. More years passed, bringing both joy and sorrow as the cycle of life continued. They lost friends to age and illness, celebrated the births of great-grandchildren, watched the world change around them as the Wild West they had known gradually transformed into something more settled and civilized. Automobiles appeared on the streets of Durango, replacing horses and wagons. Electricity came to the ranch, changing the rhythms of daily life. The bakery installed modern ovens, though Beatrice insisted on keeping one of the old wood-fired ones for special occasions. Through it all, Beatrice and Quincy remained constants for each other, anchors in a changing world. They argued sometimes because no relationship is perfect, but they always came back together, always chose each other again and again, day after day. On a warm summer evening when Beatrice was 72 and Quincy was 74, they sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. The sunset was spectacular, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, and Beatrice thought about how blessed she had been, how one moment of desperation and one cowboy's impulse purchase had led to this rich, full life. "What are you thinking about?" Quincy asked, because after so many years together he could always tell when she was lost in thought. "About bread," Beatrice said, and laughed at his surprised expression. "About how I was just trying to make enough bread to pay the rent, and instead I made a life. About how the simplest things can lead to the most extraordinary outcomes if you are open to possibility." "I was thinking about bread too," Quincy admitted. "About how lucky I was to be hungry that morning, to follow the smell of baking down a street I normally never took. One different choice, one small variation, and I might never have met you." "But you did," Beatrice said firmly. "You did meet me, and we had this whole beautiful life together. That is what matters." "That is what matters," Quincy agreed, reaching for her hand and lacing their fingers together, the gesture as natural and comfortable as breathing after all these years. They sat in peaceful silence as the sun completed its descent, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the house behind them, they could hear the sounds of family, the voices of their children and grandchildren who had come to visit for the summer. The bakery in town was closed for the night, but Beatrice knew that in the morning, Margaret's daughter, who now ran the operation, would be there before dawn, mixing dough and firing the ovens, continuing the tradition that Beatrice's grandmother had started so many years ago. Life would go on, Beatrice thought. The bread would continue to bake, the ranch would continue to run, and the love she and Quincy had built would continue to echo through their descendants, shaping them in ways large and small. It was a legacy she was proud of, built not on grand gestures or dramatic moments but on consistency, dedication, and the willingness to see possibility in a dusty cowboy at dawn. "I love you," she said to Quincy, the same words she had spoken thousands of times but which never lost their meaning or their power. "I love you too," he replied, the same response he had given thousands of times, with the same sincerity as the first time he said it. And sitting there on their porch with their hands intertwined, and their life spread out behind them like a tapestry woven from flower and love and infinite small choices, Beatrice Sterling Vale knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly the person she was meant to be with, living exactly the life she was meant to live. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The mountains stood silent and eternal against the horizon. And in the warm evening air, if you listened carefully, you could almost smell bread baking, that timeless scent of home and comfort and new beginnings that had started everything and would continue long after they were gone. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.